So we're talking about climate change in Trinidad and Tobago. I know Keisha and Kumar Singh said it's very difficult to have a happy Earth Day when you see the impacts changing around us. So next slide. On the heels of COP27, we were all coming back into Trinidad seeing this outside our plane windows. This is the Caroni Plains underwater after the deluge of rain we had in November and beginning of December. And even after I spent 3 weeks there reporting, they were there for much longer, fighting for loss and damage, adaptation, mitigation. It's a very difficult thing to have hope when you come back to a country that's underwater and you're still seeing all of these other countries globally willy-nilly with their climate policy. So today, because it's going to take quite a long time to talk about all the impacts of climate change, I'm going to focus specifically on the Trinidad and Tobago context, like I mentioned. So next slide. And talk about it from a meteorological perspective, because there are so many impacts with climate change, from sea level rise to coral reefs impact, agriculture, across so many different sectors. So we're going to talk about the meteorological impacts that we've seen in Trinidad and Tobago, and hopefully you can get some statistics away to go be the climate ambassadors we desperately need across the country. So our first slide, next slide, before we even go into the changes, let's talk about what exactly is our climate in Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is largely influenced by its island characteristics, so our mountains, proximity to the equator, our prevailing trade winds, surrounding ocean, and all of the other mountains in the region that modify the weather as it traverses the country. And all of these different types of factors mix into the tropical climate that we experience. So next slide. Trinidad and Tobago has two distinct climate seasons referred to as the wet and the dry season. We are very much in the dry season right now, but after this weekend it might feel like the wet season, especially from Saturday nights. You get a preview of the weather forecast. So there's two distinct climate seasons in Trinidad and Tobago, the wet and the dry, and there are some localized differences in these seasons across the two islands, primarily due to the size of our land, our terrain, the elevation, and the orientation of the land as well. So next slide. So in the dry season, we have the tropical maritime climates, next slide, which runs from January, generally, for the last decade. The dry season has been declared in January, and it runs until May, where, again, for the last decade, the wet season has been declared. Then, dry seasons generally characterized with cool and warm days, cool nights, warm days, and mostly some localized rainfall with relatively low amounts in the form of those brief passing showers, influenced by the island's proximity to the ocean and sometimes daytime convection. So that's why you may see some pop-up showers along western Trinidad during the afternoon. So now let's talk about the wet season. Next slide. So our wet season is called a modified moist equatorial climate. So next slide. And that typical climate runs from June to December every year. It's warmer, with more hot and humid days and nights, with relatively low wind speeds and increased rainfall. Next slide. So the rainfall during this period is very highly variable in space and time and is characterized by this bimodal pattern due to the equatorial and tropical weather system, so the ITCZ, tropical waves, tropical cyclones, troughs, you name it, we have it. And during the wet season is also the North Atlantic hurricane season, which typically can affect the southern Windward Islands and Trinidad and Tobago, whether indirectly or directly. So next slide. So Trinidad and Tobago both has a high climate variability from one year to the next. Both seasons are quite variable and prone to the extremes of droughts, dry spells, hot spells, bushfires, intense rainfall, floods. Recently we have hail, tornadoes, funnel clouds, the works. We have a lot going on. But these extremes can actually significantly impact communities, infrastructure, the economy, and the natural environment. So next slide. So how is our climate changing? And that's a question I'm going to answer today using at least our meteorology. And for those in the room, we have a lot of familiar faces who have been to COP, who have been following IPCC reports. Their projections from decades ago are already coming to pass, and even with the latest IPCC report, it is at high confidence that we're going to see these things continue. So next slide. First up, I'm going to talk about our temperatures, because this is a factor that meteorologists, climatologists, earth scientists have the highest confidence that anthropogenic climate change is affecting our temperatures. Next slide. So I'm going to start off first with talking about our new climate normals. So when referring to a climatological period, you hear above average, below average. This average is actually the average of whatever factor we're talking about, so in this case, temperatures over the last 30 years. So when we ended 2020, this meant we ended a 30-year period, and now there's going to be a new climatological average. And today's reality is much different than 30, 60, or even 100 years ago. So, first piece of data. Next slide, please. So, Trinidad and Tobago's new average temperature for 1991 to 2020, which is our new climate period, compared to 1981 to 2010, is across the board warmer. According to data from the Meteorological Services of Trinidad and Tobago, they provided a heck of a lot of data for this presentation, so kudos to them. Now, May average temperature is now just as hot as September, with the average temperature, this means the difference between the high and the low, is around 28.5 degrees Celsius. So you could hit next, I think there's an animation. So the National Climate Reference Stations for Trinidad and Tobago is actually Piarco in Trinidad and Crown Point in Tobago. And that, again, the climate reference period is between 1991 and 2020. So during this, in terms of daily average maximum temperatures as well, September is actually our warmest month, with an average maximum temperature of 33 degrees Celsius, and then April is the second warmest month. So thankfully we're ending that, and we haven't seen any extreme temperatures this year, with the average maximum temperature of 32.8 degrees Celsius. The months of May and June both have on average minimum night temperatures of 24.3 degrees, and they're generally the warmer nights on average. So we have some warm nights coming up. And we also have another season that we don't usually talk about called the heat season. This is the period of the year where we see the highest usual temperatures, and that runs from March to October. And the next peak we're actually entering that peak of that heat season. The first peak is April into May, second peak August through the first half of October. And now, I talk a lot about heat and maximum temperatures because with increasing temperatures, it's going to greatly increase the need for cooling in this country. Generally, a cooling day in Trinidad and Tobago is around 26 degrees or above. So the time spent above that is usually when we need to kick on ACs. And this cooling day is a proxy for energy use in Trinidad and Tobago. And over the last 60 years, that cooling day period actually has quadrupled, meaning we now have a demand of energy 4 times as higher as 1960 because of these increased temperatures. So next slide. And this is actually the warming trend for Trinidad and Tobago. Year to year, it is abundantly clear that this country is warming. Every single year since 1986 has been warmer than the 1961 to 1990 climatological average. 2020, which is the last year on this graph, was actually Trinidad and Tobago's 8th warmest year on record. Now, Trinidad and Tobago's maximum surface temperatures have become warmer and warmed at a rate of 24 degrees per Celsius, 24 degrees Celsius, 0.24 degrees Celsius, per decade since 1946. And that means actually our country is warming 2.5 times higher than the global average. That's not good news for us here in Trinidad and Tobago. And slightly stronger warming trends are observed during the wet season than the dry season. 7 of the 10 last years in Trinidad and Tobago are among the 12 warmest years on record here. And these warm years generally correspond with El Nino events. El Nino events are when the temperatures in the equatorial Pacific Ocean, an ocean away from here, is above 0.5 degrees Celsius. This year, we are entering another El Nino event. We've been in a La Nina phase for the last 3 years. And this particular El Nino is at least modeled to be quite strong. March, temperatures are now warming up in the Pacific, and March 2023 is already the second warmest March on record globally. So as this El Nino event ramps up, we are looking to get a particularly hot year this year. Next slide. So now we're going to look at these temperature data disaggregated by decade. And this is going to be the average temperature by decade. So the last 2 decades have been Trinidad and Tobago's warmest decades on record, spanning 2001 to 2010 and 2011 to 2020, with the mean maximum temperatures around 32, well, mean average temperatures well above the 1961 to 1980 mean. And then looking at the next slide, please. Maximum high average temperatures since 1981, they've all been very much warmer, with the 20th century average increasing, and we have seen that the daily maximum temperatures at Piarco risen about 1.1 degrees Celsius since the turn of the millennium. So, hot days, because we've talked about all of these average temperatures now. When we go outside, we feel temperatures very hot. So may I ask you to go to the next slide, please? When looking at excessive heat nationwide, the Trinidad and Tobago Meteorological Service is recording unusually hot days for the last several decades, with 2011 to 2020 having recorded the highest of 415 days, where the maximum recorded temperature was above 34 degrees Celsius, and unusually hot nights have become more common. Now, this graphic shows the decadal trend of hot days in Trinidad and Tobago from 1960 to 2020. And there's a lot of temperature data that I've shown you, but the trend is clear. We are getting hotter, faster, and that will inevitably have a multitude of knock-on effects for public health, for energy use, water consumption, agriculture, and even more. So the next thing that climate change is affecting meteorologically is our rainfall. Next slide. So climate change is affecting how we see rainfall, and next slide. Most of our rain actually, up to 70% of it. Next slide, please. Thank you. Most of our rain, up to 70% of it, comes from tropical waves, and on that satellite imagery that you're seeing there, that mass of clouds that you're seeing across the Lesser Antilles, if you can point it out on a map, that's a tropical wave, and the rest of it comes from our intertropical convergence zone. Both are features of the wet season. Next slide. So let's talk about our average rainfall before we start talking about the changes. So northeast Trinidad gets the most amount of rain, between 2,000 to 3,000 millimeters a year of rainfall in a year, compared to parts of the western parts of Trinidad and Tobago, which can get as little as 1,300 millimeters a year. Now, the wet season, which runs from generally June to December, accounts for 75 to 80% of our annual rainfall. And averaged across the entire country, our total rainfall during the dry seasons is around 412 millimeters, while the wet seasons are around 1,586 millimeters. So generally, we see more rain in the east, less rain in the west. And that's because a lot of our rainfall, our showers, our thunderstorms, the weather that affects Trinidad and Tobago moves in from eastern Trinidad. It interacts with our mountains. Those mountains squeeze out moisture, orographic precipitation, and we see a lot more rainfall, especially in northeastern Trinidad. Next slide, please. But here's the problem. On average, the rainfall at Piarco has decreased very slightly over the last 80-odd years. 2019 was the third driest on record since 1960, and over the last decade, 8 of the last 10 years produced less than average rainfall. Now, we are only in April, yet to see what this year's brings, but we've had an exceptionally dry season. Most of our rainfall in Piarco and Crown Point have been below average consistently since January. Piarco, as it stands yesterday, was only recorded 1.2 millimeters of rainfall for the month of August, which is a very, very little amount. Hence why we're seeing all of these bushfires across Trinidad and Tobago. Now, some parts of Trinidad have experienced greater decreases than others. It's not uniform, and the decrease has only become more pronounced in the last 38 years. So we're talking about 1982 to 2019. And next slide, please. During June through August, this is when we usually see most of our rainfall in Trinidad and Tobago, and there has been a decline in the amount of rain that we receive. This is at Piarco, using the annual averages. And most of our rainfall occurs in the first half of the wet season, and then we're seeing shifts in seasonal rainfall observed. So since 1946, the June, July, and August rainfall has decreased, with the same period over the last decade experiencing 11% less rainfall than that for the 1961 to 1990 period. So we are seeing declines in our overall rainfall during this wettest period of the month, attributed to climate change. And that is in line with the IPCC's projection and what they say with high confidence for the entire Caribbean region. So the problems that we're experiencing in Trinidad, the impacts that we're seeing unfold with our weather, it's not just for Trinidad and Tobago, but the Caribbean region at large. So next slide, please. We're now looking at rainfall by the decade. The mean rainfall totals have decreased at Piarco below the 30-year mean rainfall average from 1961 to 1990 at a rate about 10 millimeters per decade, or 50 millimeters per half century. Now, 2011 to 2020 was the driest decade on record at Piarco since records began at the monitoring site. I'm talking a lot about millimeters and rainfall and all of this, but it's important for Trinidad and Tobago because as it stands right now, between 60 and 70% of our surface water is actually our drinking water. When we run out of surface water, we literally have no drinking water left outside of the desalination plants. WASA, as Kishan mentioned, this climate change risk management, they decided groundwater is more stable to the extreme weather's pattern that we see during the wet and dry season. So they're investing more in groundwater, but then you now have the problem of sea level rise, which could affect our coastal aquifers and make it more saline. And at least 4 of our aquifers have already become too saline to extract from. So we are not in a great position when it comes to rainfall overall. And this is something that we should be cognizant of when we have water restrictions in place. The more water that is in our system, the people on the extremities of our water system can actually access it. So next slide, please. Our changes in our rainfall also is not uniform across the country. The data that you've seen is mostly for Piarco, but this shows us the changes across the entire country. So not all areas are experiencing the same level of dryness, and this across the entirety of Tobago, Trinidad's western and southern halves, we've all seen a reduction of rainfall rather, with rainfall actually increasing across parts of east central and northeastern Trinidad. Now, that's good news for our reservoirs because most of our reservoirs in Trinidad exist either in our south central or eastern parts of the island. In Tobago, the Hillsborough Reservoir, because they've seen the same data, they actually dredged the Hillsborough Reservoir over the last year, adding about 100 million gallons of water. I believe that's the figure that the Public Utilities Minister said. So they are making strides for our water management, but climate change is making it increasingly difficult for us to get drinking water in this country. So like we had new climate normals for temperatures, let's take a look, next slide, of our new climate normals for rainfall. And when we ended 2020, we had a very dry period in 2019, so this didn't come as news to many of us, where we saw that our new climate normals, nearly across the board, is slightly drier. The only month that actually got slightly wetter was March, and that was likely increased due to the severe thunderstorms we had in March 2018 and a couple other Marches prior, where we had some rainfall events that skewed that average up ever so slightly in the last decade. Now, average rainfall for February, January, and December remains unchanged, and notably, all wet season months are now drier than normal. And this is all in line with the IPCC's projections, where overall rainfall has decreased, especially during that June through August period. So, next slide. Now let's talk about extremes, because when that rainfall comes, it comes very, very extreme. The frequency of single-day rainfall events remain fairly steady at Piarco, but at an average of extreme rainfall, meaning 50 millimeters of rainfall or more in a 24-hour period, we're seeing a marginal increase across the board. But from 1985 to present, the average number of extreme single-day rainfall events have trended higher. Based on the records from the Trinidad and Tobago Meteorological Service over the last 35 years, 2020 tied 2008 for the highest number of extreme single rainfall day events in Trinidad and Tobago, with 7 extreme rainfall days. Now, the data is still being crunched for the last 2 years, but we've had significant rainfall events for both of those years, so we'll likely see this trend marginally increase as well. Next slide. And taking a look at the annual extreme maximum one-day rainfall totals for Piarco from 1960 to 2020. In recent years, a larger percentage of rainfall from Piarco has come from intense precipitation, these extremely wet rainfall days. Now, there's been a steady increase of rainfall accumulating in the highest annual daily rainfall totals from this extreme weather. And according to the Met Office, 6 of the highest top 10 years for the highest one-day maximum rainfall totals at Piarco have occurred since 1990. Next slide, please. But similar to the drying trend, this is not occurring uniformly across Trinidad and Tobago. Now, about half show trends, about half of these weather stations from the Met Service across Trinidad and Tobago show trends that is declining. Some are showing trends that are increasing. Those triangles that you're seeing on the map are scaled according to the magnitude of the trend. The solid blue triangles correspond to an increasing trend that is statistically significant, but the unfilled blue triangles are an increasing trend that's not significant, vice versa for the red ones. The solid red triangles, a decreasing trend with a 5% level of decrease versus the red triangles not significantly significant, statistically rather. So next slide, and that was 1 days. We were talking about extreme rainfall, but you know in Trinidad, when it rains, it pours, and we get a significant amount of flooding across the country that happens over a multi-day period, like we saw last year, October, November, December. Taking a look at the 72-hour period, from 1960 to 2020, there's been an increase in the maximum 3-day totals over the last decade, over the last 6 decades. And when there are high 3-day rainfall totals, Trinidad and Tobago typically experiences very high impact flooding events. So think of Greenvale in 2018, where we saw 250 millimeters recorded at Piarco, but other parts of the country saw upwards to 400 millimeters of rainfall in that 72-hour period. And anything in Trinidad and Tobago, once you hear somebody say it's above 100 millimeters of rain inside 72 hours, cause for concern, flood boots needed. So taking a look at that trend too across the country, next slide please, it's still not uniform. Very similar to our 1-day trends. Nearly half the stations are showing some increase, half the stations are showing decreases. And how is this extreme precipitation affecting our overall annual rainfall total? Next slide please. There's been an increase in increasingly wet days or extremely wet days, or days in the top 1% of our daily rainfall accumulations, contributing to our annual rainfall totals. Notably, 2019, which was exceptionally dry, did not produce any extremely wet days, but as a reminder, we had a lot of those in 2021 and 2022. That data is still being crunched, so we'll probably have an updated graphic from the Met Office quite soon. Now, something I wanted to point out, which goes against everything that scientists know about what these projections are showing, next slide please, is that in October, which is in the wet season in Trinidad and Tobago, we actually have an increase in rainfall, which is very surprising because the overall projections are supposed to be a decline. And October has been known to produce some prolific flood events in Trinidad and Tobago, November as well. So we're still, this is under investigation. If I have an answer, watch out for it on CNC3 News. But now I'm getting close to the end of this data pack presentation, and I cannot end it without talking about, next slide please, some Saharan dust. So does it have a link to climate change? Because a lot of us, we knew it's in the air, we know it's here, but you only hear about it recently because myself, Sigoni, Ian Wallace, we all talk about it a lot more on our weather forecasts, and the Met Office has actually launched forecasting tools for air quality and Saharan dust. So next slide, please. So this is actually from the Met Office. They've been tracking Saharan dust for the last several decades, and for Trinidad and Tobago, we see a lot more Saharan dust during the dry season than the wet season, at least through June. That's when we see the highest amount of dust haze days. Those are days that our visibility and air quality will be affected by Saharan dust. And you can see on that graph, there is an increase, quite a significant one. So is this linked to climate change? Next slide, please. Well, that trend is not necessarily settled in science yet. If you go and search Saharan dust climate change on Google or Bing or whichever search engine is your preference, you will get both answers, yes and no. Now, I want to think it ended on a happy Earth Day, so I'm going to choose NASA's study, which shows we are actually entering a period of a 20,000-year low in Saharan dust moving across the Atlantic Ocean. Why I actually agree with them, and that's bad science to agree and not agree, is that climate change is supposed to make our globe warmer. And that means our oceans are also going to be warmer. When we have a warm Atlantic Ocean, our trade winds are weaker. When we have weaker trade winds, that Saharan dust, when it gets up into the atmosphere over Africa, does not have that tailwind to push it across the Atlantic Ocean and make its way to Trinidad and Tobago or Brazil, where it is a great nutrient beneficent to the Amazon rainforest. So on a happy end to a happy Earth Day, I'm going to say, let's hope Saharan dust stays away. Thank you very much.